This is Fans on the Run, a podcast made by, for, and about Beatles fans. And now, here's your host, Ethan Alexanian.
Hello. Welcome back to Fans on the Run. I'm your host, Ethan Alexanian. Today, we have another Canadian on the show, which is nice for once. He's the author of The Beatles in Canada, The Origins of Beatlemania, the upcoming book, The Evolution, 1964 to 1970, which is the sequel to his first Beatles in Canada book, and one of the co-founders / webmasters of the Capital 6000 series website, which is it's an invaluable resource for any Canadian record fan with an emphasis on the Beatles. Piers Hemmingsen. Piers, thank you for coming on.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So you are, if I'm not mistaken, Canada's biggest Beatles nerd.
I guess. I don't know how it all happened, but I go back a long way. I lived in England in 1961 through 1963, and I got to see the Beatles on television when they were starting out, and moved back to Canada, and the rest is I just followed along.
Yeah. So you got to experience the Beatles before, the rest of the people in North America did, because you saw them on what would have been Thank Your Lucky Stars or Top of the Pops.
It was Thank Your Lucky Stars. Yeah, absolutely.
And so, would you like to talk about your upcoming book, The Evolution?
I would. I'll just give a little background. You mentioned the Capital 6000 website. I actually started that website, with a bunch of text files and things like that in the 1990s. So I think it's come a long way, and I certainly had help from Serge Pelletier over there in Quebec in terms of bringing it up the curve. I've done 4 other books that started, I guess the first one came out in 1999. It was the Beatles Canadian discography. That ended up being 4 volumes. And then that was really to talk about the records, the tapes, whatever music the Beatles produced in Canada, whatever format. And then I got into the history. So the Redbook is all about how the Beatles got going in Canada, early rock and roll, how things happened here in 1963, starting with Love Me Do. And then that came out in March of 2016. And I remember, I think it's written somewhere in that book that I'm going to take a break from it. But the break wasn't, it was Paul White that said that. I took a little break, and then I decided, okay, we're going to do a red book, we got to do a blue book. And that's when I started The Evolution, which picks up pretty much after the end of the first Canadian tour in '64, and then goes all the way up until the Beatles break up. And, the last chart entry of The Long and Winding Road is on a Canadian chart, and pretty much that's the end of the book, bar a couple of extra bits I've thrown in. But the idea was to document as well as possible the history of how the Beatles started in this country, and then really get into some of the detail about the special things they did with Canada right up and until the end. So, Canada has a great history with the group. So I'm just about finished writing the blue book. It's a massive thing. We're going to have to, like the maple syrup, we're going to have to boil it down a bit. And I'm very, very pleased with it so far.
I can't wait for it to come out.
Me too.
Because I think the impact that Canada had on Beatlemania and the Beatles' career is severely understated. Because, well, She Loves You was already in the top 20 of the Chum charts before I Want to Hold Your Hand was even released in the States.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, we got Beatlemania before everyone else did. Except for, well, we got Beatlemania first in North America.
Mm-hmm. Well, we ended up with the largest organized Beatles fan club, official Beatles fan club, and I think by 1964, 65, it was about 500 more members, more than the British fan club. So how about that? When the Beatles came to do Ed Sullivan, there was no U.S. fan club, and they flew down the two girls from the Ontario Beatles fan club to meet the Beatles, to hang out with them at the Park Plaza Hotel. And the Beatles were always big on their fan clubs. I think there was a real role that the fan club played in the popularity of the Beatles right across Canada.
Is that true, that they actually flew down members of the Canadian fan club to sign up members for the U.S. fan clubs?
No, that part's not true. The Canadian fan club, it was more or less a thank you, and something I discovered when I was doing the research for the Blue Book is that because of the popularity of the Beatles in Canada right before Christmas of 1963, there was talk of having a Beatles concert at Maple Leaf Gardens circa February the 10th, 64. Of course, that ended up getting dropped because there was a Carnegie Hall concert, there was a Washington concert, and I think it was Brian Epstein's plan to go big in the States. Canada was interesting, but it wasn't the market that the Beatles really wanted to conquer. That was the States.
Yeah. So, now I'm going to ask you some questions about yourself, not just the Beatles, but about you.
Sure.
When did you first discover the Beatles?
Well, I would pin it down to the record Please Please Me. And my family and I were living in England. We were in my father was a military man, and we lived in a place called Lark Hill, which was an army base, Lark Hill Camp, near Salisbury in Wiltshire, England. And if you're familiar with the Help movie, they even filmed some of the Help movie on Salisbury Plain, which is where my father was based, where we lived. And I have two older brothers, and very influential in terms of my musical education. There was a lot of American rock and roll on British radio waves, pretty much through Radio Luxembourg. My brother had a transistor radio. He was always listening to Radio Luxembourg. Saturday mornings, there was some BBC pop music, but there wasn't a lot. When the Beatles came along, all three of us went to the same school, and my oldest brother Randall was told by his peer group that the Beatles were happening, and to watch out for them. So we paid attention. He paid attention. Because he paid attention, I paid attention, and we saw them perform Please Please Me. We heard the record. And it wasn't long, I think it was Easter of 63 when Randall bought the stereo copy of the album, and my parents in their great wisdom bought a stereo record player. So it was really quite something to hear that album when it came out in stereo in our own home. And of course we had the From Me to You 45, and then we ended up moving back to Canada in the summer of 63. Nobody had heard of the Beatles, and my brother, again, God bless him, took it upon himself to introduce the Beatles to our local radio station, which was CHOV in Pembroke, Ontario. Mm-hmm. And there was a lovely man there named Roger Stanion, and Roger had a British background, and he told my brother, look, bring your records by the station and I'll play them. And he did. The records got played. This is around October of 63. Mm-hmm. And there was a pocket of sort of interest in the Upper Ottawa Valley around the Beatles, and I think that was happening across Canada, in Winnipeg, in places like London, Ontario, in Oshawa. I mean, I've documented it all in the book, but radio stations were very localized, and many picked up on the Beatles thanks to the promotional efforts of Paul White at Capitol, who was really pushing the Beatles, starting with Love Me Do, Please Please Me, From Me to You. And yeah, She Loves You was the record that broke the Beatles, but there were places like Winnipeg and Sault Ste. Marie and other places where From Me to You was a big record, even before She Loves You. So there was a real build-up of interest in the Beatles throughout 1963 in Canada. And the odd thing is, rock and roll entered the Canadian space in the 50s through airwaves from the States. And here the Beatles were bringing back, American-style rock and roll to Canada. And Canada had picked up on it before the States. Capitol in the States had an A&R guy who was Paul White's equivalent, named Dave Dexter. And Dave was a jazz guy who'd been with Capitol for many years. And he wasn't a big fan of the harmonica. So when Love Me Do came around, he passed on it. Nobody picked up on Love Me Do in the States, and it wasn't issued in the States until February of '64. When Please Please Me followed that, he passed on it, and it went over to VJ out of Chicago. And VJ didn't do so well with it, but they picked up From Me to You, issued that on VJ. That didn't do so well. And then when She Loves You came along, there was a big push in the States from EMI in the UK, and even Capitol passed on that one. And that went to Swan out of Philadelphia. So pretty much throughout 1963, Capitol in the States didn't want to know about the Beatles. But up here in Canada, it was a completely different story. Paul White had followed from Love Me Do, Please Please Me, From Me to You, right up through all of it, lockstep with what was being issued in the UK by EMI. Although we did lag a bit on Love Me Do, but we certainly, if you were paying attention, you could buy these records in record shops across Canada.
And that's why I think we got the better end of the deal than the US did, because now in retrospect we have all the nice Beatles singles on the Swirl Capitol label that they didn't, all the classics I Want to Hold Your Hand.
If you're a record collector, it's a lot easier if you're collecting Canadian Beatle records than trying to figure out which Tolly pressing or VJ pressing or Swan record you have. It's a different collecting experience.
I've tried collecting the VJ Swan Tollys, but they just confuse me. Although collecting the original Canadian 45s isn't a whole lot easier, because then you have like the odd ducks like Silip Deek, which is like a couple $100. And what's the other one? I think it's Do You Want to Know a Secret? Is quite expensive.
Yeah, well, they're expensive because they're hard to find in really nice condition.
Yeah.
Kids played the crap out of these things back in the day, so it's a different exercise to try and find these records in decent playable condition. And that's where I think the marketplace puts a premium on condition and some of these records as well, like the two you mentioned, weren't manufactured in large quantities because A, they were already on an album, and B, who wants to hear She Loves You in German after you've got it in English?
Yeah.
It's a limited market.
I'm sure it would have been popular here in Kitchener because of all the Oktoberfest stuff, but it seems like a limited appeal.
Yeah, but it was like 6 months after it was on the charts. You're back then, if you were a kid like I was listening to the radio, every week there was new stuff. So you weren't really interested in winding the clock backwards 6 months.
And listening.
Maybe in Kitchener, I don't know.
And then listening to the same song, but in a language that you probably don't understand.
It is kind of an interesting record, and given that the Beatles started off in Hamburg and that their first fans were German, it is kind of a loop that needed to be closed, I guess.
I guess. But for the rest of us internationally, it's more of a novelty than anything.
Yeah, I mean, Michel was a very popular record in Canada, especially in Quebec, because of it was sung partially in French, and it was a great record for a French group to cover.
Well, now that you touched on that, there are some groups out of Quebec that did some very fantastic covers of Beatles songs in the 60s. One that particularly...
I love those.
One that particularly sticks out to me is group Les Sinners did a wonderful cover of Penny Lane.
Yes, yep, I know that one.
Yeah, and for all you Canadian history buffs, it's the same group that did the song Go Go Trudeau for the 68 election.
That is a fact. That is a fact.
Yeah.
I will tell you this extra information. You're asking about my background. We moved from that Camp Petawawa in the Pembroke area to Western Quebec in, I think it was the summer of '65, just as Help was coming out. And by that time I had a radio of my own, and quite often I would listen to radio stations from Hull, CKCH, I believe it was, and they would play a number of different pop records, which were covers of anything you could think of that was from the British invasion. And I quite got to like a lot of those groups. I didn't know who they were, of course, but the one that covered Michel was Les Atomes. And I thought that was the Beatles. I thought that was the Beatles, and it was very well produced, and it was entirely in French. I liked it. Something, if people haven't heard it, I recommend it.
The only thing I will say about the Les Sinners cover of Penny Lane is that the video catches you off guard at first, because the first shot is a guy smoking a cigarette with his feet. So, do with that what you will.
Yeah, that's not so Beatlish.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it was 67, so even in Canada they were probably all high.
Well, we could probably not talk about that, but it's up to you.
All right, what was your first? Well, you said your first Beatles album was "Please Please Me," but once you got to Canada,
well, that was my brother's. That
Okay.
was my brother's record, and I didn't get my first record of my own album until Something New. So that was the summer of '64. But before that, of course, we didn't need to buy Twist and Shout because it was already on. Everything on there was already on Please Please Me. And we had the first Canadian album, which was Beatlemania with the Beatles. And that was just a huge selling album just before Christmas of 1963. So when I was doing the Redbook, I got some great stories about how people ended up with that album under their Christmas tree in 1963, and what an influential record it was.
Yeah.
And for the Blue Book, I've had so many great interviews. I've interviewed people like Randy Bachman and Anne Murray or David Clayton Thomas, all these people who were hugely Bruce Cockburn influenced by the Beatles, and I wanted to get and include their stories. And it's amazing how many people talk about those early Canadian albums, especially Beatlemania and Twist and Shout, and Burton Cummings is another one. They will tell you exactly. They can remember where they were when they first heard those records, and just how musically influential they were on their own careers.
Mm-hmm. The only subpar one of the original Canadian albums, in my opinion, is Long Tall Sally, which it seems a little unnecessary.
There's not a lot of new material on there. If you had the other two albums and you bought some of the singles, there was, Misery. But again, maybe you wanted to have them on an album. But there was a great story I have in the Redbook about kids who would walk into a record store and see that album, Long Tall Sally. And at the time, record stores were importing the album from the States, the second album that was already released before Long Tall Sally. Mm-hmm. And I think we called that fooling 9-year-old kids. You didn't know what you were getting. And you got it home and you said, hey, I've got all this material. What's going on? And why is there something called Meet the Beatles and something called Beatlemania with the Beatles? Like, it was confusing as heck for young Beatles fans. And there were a lot of young Beatles fans like myself.
Mm-hmm. But, I do really like those early Canadian albums. And
there's more tracks. Yeah, there's more tracks than their U.S. counterparts. And I think I was on something a few weeks ago where they talked about the limitations of American records having only 5 or 6 songs on each side, and it had to do with the work involved in copyright and royalty collection. And that Canada didn't seem to have that same problem, and I don't know why that was the case, but that was explained to me as the reason why American albums had fewer tracks on each side.
Really? I thought that was more of a money grabbing technique from Capitol in the States.
Well, I think it's a combination of what you're saying. You can make more money, and it's less work, I guess, per album.
Yeah. For every one British Beatles album, there's like 3 American ones.
Mm-hmm. Which I don't have a problem with, because, those American albums are great. You get great pictures, and I don't know. You'd have to wait a long time living in England between albums. Whereas in the States, they just crank them out.
Oh, yeah. So, you said you moved to Quebec in 65? Mm-hmm.
Summer of 65, yeah.
How popular were the Beatles in Quebec, being an English group?
Well, Montreal, again, I go back to the Redbook. I couldn't write from the perspective of a francophone living in Quebec, so but I knew somebody that could, and that was Gilles Valiquette. And Gilles is a huge Beatles fan. He's also a wonderful musician, and he wrote the section about the Beatles in Quebec, and the whole sort of Two Solitudes thing in Montreal that was happening at the time, where you had one part of Montreal was solidly English, and a much larger part of Montreal that was solidly Francophone. But the incredible thing is that the Beatles transcended all of this linguistic differentiation and the different cultures. Their music spoke to everybody. So something I'm really pleased about, again, is to have Gilles contributing to the Blue Book as well, about how things developed in Quebec with the Beatles through Sgt. Pepper and the White Album and things like that, because it is definitely a different cultural experience. But I would say that if you looked around today, the number of Beatles fans in Quebec is by far the largest in Canada. There's a lot of Beatle fans in Quebec. So
Really?
Gilles wrote his own book, of course. Yeah, there's a lot of Beatles fans in Quebec, and they're very, very, you know, they're hardcore. That's what I would say.
More
And,
than Ontario.
Yeah, I'd say there's a lot of Beatles fans in Quebec, and they have a very well organized fan club still going today. And yeah, I would say that. And here I am living in Toronto and telling you this. Yeah, I've been to Montreal, I've been to Quebec City, I lived in Hull, it's now called Gatineau. Yeah, the Beatles were hugely influential in Quebec.
So, what do the Beatles mean to you personally?
What do they mean to me personally? Well, I go back to my, I sort of, my story about the Let It Be movie, when it came to Ottawa in 1970, I walked out of it. It was so depressing and so sad to see, the group that I loved to kind of follow it all the way through up and until, Abbey Road, all of a sudden they're this squabbling group of people up on a big screen. I kind of went away from the Beatles, and it wasn't until maybe 1974, 75, I went down to New York City, and I was still interested in records, and I went into some record stores in Greenwich Village, and one of them was on, I think it was called Bleecker Bob's or House of Oldies or one of those, and
one of those is still open, I think.
Probably. It's been a while since I've been down there, but I remember I took the train from Ottawa to Montreal and then overnight from Montreal to New York City, and I brought a huge cardboard box of what I thought were rare Canadian records. And I thought, well, I can go down and trade these for, lovely, beautiful butcher cover or something that would be a nice addition for my own collection. And it was really hot. I guess it was in the summertime. And I remember bringing these into the store and seeing if I could trade them. And they seemed interested. But when he looked at them, this is the one particular, I think his name was Bleecker Bob.
Yeah.
He said that, Canadian records aren't worth anything and nobody wants them. And that stuck with me. And I thought, why would that be that, they got, I had copies of Very Together, I had a Let It Be box set. I thought these things would sell well to a collectibles store in New York City. But that wasn't the case. So I ended up lugging them all back to Canada. And that experience was something that, I was interested in records from all over the world, so I couldn't understand why people would have something against Canadian records. And the more I got into the history of Canadian records, I understood that they were high quality. They were manufactured to a very high standard. The Beatle albums could take a beating on anybody's turntable, and you could play them again and again and again, and they would still sound pretty good. Mm-hmm. So it kind of stuck with me. And then when I had the time in kind of the 1990s as a bit of a hobby, I thought, well, somebody's got to write the history of how all these Canadian Beatle records were different from the rest of the Beatle records around the world. And other people were doing that in the UK. Mark Lewison was doing his great recording sessions book. Mm-hmm. Bruce Spicer was starting to work on his VJ book. So I was able to contact these people, and I did my own kind of thing and contacted people up here in Canada. And I ended up writing these, basically, the Beatles Canadian discography books. I think between them there's 600 pages. Part 1 dealt with the 45s, Part 2 dealt with the albums and tapes, Part 3 dealt with the Apple solo things while the Beatles were still going. And then I did a complete drill into the matrix information for these records to find out when and where they were manufactured, and so that was just getting the information out there. And of course the internet was coming along, that helped. So really it was that experience in New York City, I think, back in I'm going to say 74, 75, and I went back there again and again and again. I even worked there for a while. It was just something that I had to do, and you get this call from somewhere up above, and you say, okay, I'm going to have to do this regardless of what it's going to do to me personally. It has to be done. And the upside of it, Ethan, is that I'm just about finished this long and winding road, and I think it'll be as good as anybody can do it. I've had access to some great people. Paul White, of course, who helped not only with the Red Book, but he all the way through the Blue Book research. He was able to provide everything up and to Let It Be. So I think it'll be as good as any Canadian researcher could have done it at the time, and that's my goal.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't doubt you for a second that you'd be able to pull it off.
Well, I'm hoping. Virus or no virus, this is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any favorite memories of being a Beatles fan, or favorite memories involving the Beatles?
Oh, sure. I mean, I think the excitement of getting a new Beatle record for your birthday or for Christmas, the ones that really stick out for me would be, getting Rubber Soul, getting Revolver. I remember getting Revolver twice. I got 2 copies. What can you do with 2 copies of a record? I got Revolver for Christmas, and I also got it from a cousin of mine. So Revolver sticks out. I didn't always get them, when the day they were released. I had to, I had a paper round. Sometimes I had to save up the money. So I think my favorite memories are just working hard sometimes to be able to afford a Beatle long player, buying the singles. Like I remember buying Day Tripper and We Can Work It Out and Paperback Writer, all these great singles, one after another, and there was a lot of great other records. There groups like the Kinks or the Yardbirds or whatever you liked. There was always new good stuff. So the Beatles had this knack of leading the pack in terms of every time they came out with a record. In my opinion, they would leapfrog everybody else, and they went to a whole new space, and then everybody else would follow into that space. And I think Sgt. Pepper was an album I couldn't afford to buy it when it was released, but I had a cousin that had it, and I remember buying that with him. He bought it. I was with him when we were at Expo 67 in Montreal, and that was a whole different experience because of the packaging, the whole idea that there was some drug connection with it. There was all this interesting thing in looking at the cover. I don't know. Magical Mystery Tour is a highlight for me because I got that for Christmas. My brother bought it for me for Christmas, and he got the Rolling Stones' Satanic Majesty's Request. So side by side, I could compare those 2 records. They were both great albums. Mm-hmm. I still like the Beatles better.
Yeah.
I don't know. So my happiest memories, I think, are just this sort of voyage I was on of discovery, of finding music that I liked, because I think largely I listened to the music on my own. I was the youngest of three boys. I had more time, it seems to me, on my own, and I just listened to a lot of music on records. And going back to your comment about being a Beatles nerd, I guess I was just interested. I never loved the Beatles as individuals. That not in the way that girls did in 1964. I love their records, and I still do. And I think they put out some unbelievably great masterpieces of artwork and vinyl combined. They're just incredible things to enjoy.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned him earlier, and I think I just wanted to give a quick mention of Paul White from Capital Canada, who had the hindsight to actually like keep his ear to the ground in England and actually sign like all of these great British bands that Capitol in the U.S. and Dave Dexter Jr., Alan Livingston didn't bother to sign. And so that's why in Canada you had, you know, the Hollies, the Dave Clark Five, Jerry and the Pacemakers, the Yardbirds. They were all on Capitol because of him.
Well, add in Manfred Mann, add in Sounds Incorporated, add in a whole pile of other. These are all EMI groups, and of course, what I think what's important to me is that Canada had a different demographic than the United States. Two different countries, of course, and what was popular up here wasn't always popular down in the States. I was at the Beatle Fest some years ago and giving a talk about the Beatles in Canada, and I was talking about how Billy J. Kramer had charted with Do You Want to Know a Secret on some Canadian radio stations in the summer of '63, and a gentleman at the back of the room stuck up his hand, and I said, yeah, would you like to ask a question? He said, well, I'm Billy J. Kramer, and I wanted to tell you that EMI was always great, and no matter what region it was, whether it was Canada or the States, he remembered that Canada always sent him the royalties, so he was very, very grateful. He was popular in Canada through '64 and '65, and he was largely popular because he had some great hits. You know, Bad to Me, I'll Keep You Satisfied, Do You Want to Know a Secret? A lot of Lennon-McCartney songs that he covered, and he covered them really well. But it was kind of cool that he remembered how important Canada was, and I think that goes back to Paul White, who promoted these artists. And you know, when Jerry and the Pacemakers, they were the first NEMS act to tour Canada in May of '64, so they were like the advance party before the Beatles did their North American tour. They played at the Eaton's Auditorium in Toronto in May of '64. They played in Montreal in one of the suburbs the next night, I believe. They also did concerts in Winnipeg. So these artists, Billy J. Kramer played in Ottawa. So they toured Canada, and you know, they would have Tony Barrow with them as their public PR person. So there was a lot of interesting stuff happening with all of those EMI artists that ended up on the Capitol 6000 label. And God bless Paul, he's not with us any longer, but one thing I enjoyed about working with him, and I got to work with him over the last 25 years or so, he was phenomenal with his memory. So, you know, if I mentioned a record, he could pop out the first order. So like the Let It Be box set, oh yeah, we ordered 5,000 of those, and then we ordered another 5,000, another. He knew exactly when and how many. So that was fantastic to get his help on the Blue Book, and he will certainly be prominent he is prominent in the Blue Book as well.
Mm-hmm. His influence on the Canadian impact of the British invasion cannot be overstated.
No, absolutely.
You just reminded me something when you were talking about British groups touring. My favorite weird little tidbit or piece of trivia that I found on your website, the Capitol 6000 series. Mm-hmm. I was reading up on the Yardbirds in Canada, and
oh yes,
how on their '67 tour they played just Vancouver, and then for some reason Huntsville, which baffles me.
Yeah, that's a great one.
It's like, why? Yeah. What the hell are the Yardbirds doing in Huntsville? Well,
there's a good story there. The Yardbirds had done really well on Capital of Canada. I remember we got Over Under Sideways Down.
Love
we were
that.
members of the Capitol Record Club, so we got that album. I think it was 66 or early 67. But Little Games was their sort of album of 67. That's when they added Jimmy Page.
Yeah.
And when I started looking at doing that work about the Yardbirds, they literally had played a concert in New York City, probably within the 24 hours before they were in Huntsville. Their airplane took them up to Huntsville, and their manager, who I believe also went on to manage Led Zeppelin, Peter Grant, had some sort of buddy in the Muskokas with a cottage, and thought, well, let's just bring the Yardbirds up there, and then I can go and visit my friend. It was either Lake Rosso or Lake Joseph or something like that. So they didn't play in Huntsville, they played at the Hidden Valley Ski Club. And they had this, we're getting off Beatle topic here, of course, but
it's fine.
They had like a discotheque on 3 levels. And the opening act was the Staccatos. And the Staccatos were another Capital of Canada discovery, managed by
Ottawa,
Sandy
right?
Gardner. They're from Ottawa. And Paul White and Sandy Gardner were always in touch, and Sandy originally managed the Esquires, then he managed the Staccatos, and the Staccatos, I think, were one of those great bands, but they opened for the Yardbirds. The Yardbirds didn't arrive until midnight. Perhaps they were swimming or something at this other cottage, I don't know, but people, I didn't go to that show, but people I did interview who were there, it was the Jimmy Page lineup, and that was an opportunity for kids up in cottage country to see, a really early version of Led Zeppelin. And as you said, the only other concerts they did were out in Vancouver. They did one cool event where they signed records at a record store on the outskirts of Vancouver. They were hugely influential as a group, the Yardbirds. Again, Capital 6000 had all of their stuff, and great stuff.
While we're on the subject of, fascinating, weird pieces of trivia, what is your personal favorite weird piece of knowledge about, the Canadian version of the British invasion, the Canadian releases or anything that might have happened in Canada involving these groups?
Yeah, so the most inconsequential thing, but the most interesting thing to me, was that I used to take this bus every Saturday to take me downtown in Ottawa to go to these record stores like Alex Sherman and the Treble Clef, and I would browse through records. I had no money to buy, but I had this passion for records. So just going into the store and spending an hour looking at what was available was very fulfilling, even though I could only afford maybe a single and not always an album. But this Elmer bus that took me from Elmer into Ottawa would wind its way through Hull, Quebec, and this E.B. Eddy company had this massive stack of logs waiting to be turned into pulp and paper. And it was only all these years later, when I was doing the research for the Blue Book, and I got into the archives of paperwork that Paul White had kindly offered to me to do research from, that I discovered that the record jacket manufacturers were using cardboard and paper. The paper for the slicks, Pars, print and litho, the cardboard for the jackets, Modern Album, all came from E.B. Eddy. And those logs, those stack of timber that I would go by, and the stench of that place, the pulp was such a pungent smell. I had no idea that those Beatles albums, the jackets and the slicks and all those things that I really thought were interesting, came from trees that were that were cut down and turned into pulp and paper. So, like I was saying, the most inconsequential things kind of made me the happiest when I was doing the research into this blue book. I had no idea that everything has to start from somewhere, and whether it's Beatles music or jazz or blues or folk, anything world music, it all has to come from somewhere. And I laugh about this Beatles in Canada story, how really some of it comes from trees, and it's kind of funny to me.
I probably have some of those, or I probably have records made from some of those same trees and stacks of lumber that you saw.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's kind of funny, it's kind of funny. And all these years later, I'm looking back and thinking, gosh, it's a different way of looking at it.
Mm-hmm. All right, now it's time for my personal favorite segment of the show. I'm going to hit you with some quick-fire questions.
Sure.
What is your favorite Beatles song?
Well, that's an easy one. It's usually Norwegian Wood, because my family background through my grandparents has a link to Norway. So Norwegian Wood is not only that, but it's also a great song, and it has a lot of atmosphere. And I'd say that Rubber Soul is just an amazing record. I can't really ever I like the Canadian Rubber Soul because
Hold on, you keep cutting in and out.
Very much an album that has no singles, although of course Michelle was covered by other people, but it's an album that stands on its own, and we don't get that again until Sgt. Pepper. So to me, Rubber Soul in Canada is like an earlier Sgt. Pepper, because there's no singles, all the songs are great, and Norwegian Wood is on it, and that's the song I like.
All right.
Of all songs.
What
Happens
is
to be
your
a John song?
Okay. What is your least favorite Beatles song?
I think I just said it. What Goes On. I think that is I don't know what happened with that, what they were thinking, but that song really, to me, it's like some of the songs that are left off, and you hear them on Anthology, 12 Bar Blues or whatever. These things were probably, I know you always read about John or Paul saying that song wasn't a good song, but What Goes On, to me, I'm sorry, it's okay, but it's not a great Beatles song.
Yeah. What is your favorite, and I think you probably said it, your favorite Beatles album?
Well, I said Rubber Soul, but even before that, and I think the record that really changed things for me was Help. And Help in Canada was more of a soundtrack album. And again, this is covered in the blue book that I'm working on, but it's a great album because of the Ken Thorne music. Here, Richard Lester, who directed Hard Day's Night, and he directed Help. He had worked with George Martin on the music. George had provided theme music for A Hard Day's Night, the film, but they didn't really get along so well. And really, I think Richard Lester preferred to work with Ken Thorne. And if you listen to a lot of Ken Thorne's music, he did the music for A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Forum, which was another Dick Lester movie. He did the music for How I Won the War with John Lennon, acting in that. Ken Thorne provided really interesting music for Help. So it included sitar, it included classical music, it included flute, Indian instruments. And I think if you were in my shoes listening to an album in 1965, to have that kind of music all on one package with great Beatles songs like You've Got to Hide Your Love Away or Another Girl or The Night Before, that to me was the album that really got me into Beatle albums. You know, Something New was interesting. There's some good stuff on it, but it wasn't a cohesive piece of work like Help was. Help, I think, was the record that I would, you know, if I had to just have one influential record, that would be it.
What is your least favorite Beatles album?
Least favorite? I don't know. I don't. They're all great. I mean, I'm somebody who loves Yellow Submarine, and I love the George Martin music on the B-side. Something New is probably a record I don't play too much. I bought Beatles 6 when it came out, and I like that. I'd probably say Something New. I mean, I won't even mention the Beatles Story because I don't think that's a Beatles album per
Not
se.
really.
It's more of a documentary type of thing. But I'd say of all of them, I'd say Something New was some kind of business deal with United Artists where they could get some songs and put out a capital album. And you don't hear people raving about Something New.
Mm-hmm. Fair point. All right.
Yeah.
So it comes to that tragic part of the show where we have to wrap things up. It's
Okay.
It is so sad. Okay, Piers, where can
Well.
people find you?
Well, I live in Toronto. You can find me here. Although these days it's we got to keep our distance. But I'm on the internet. People can follow me on Twitter at Beatles in Canada. The website for the book really isn't going to be updated until I've got the book ready to go. The Beatles in Canada Redbook, you can find out there on Amazon, and you can find it on eBay. There's copies still around. This was the 2016 Redbook soft cover that was signed and numbered, comes with an audio disc. The blue disc will also come with an audio disc. If anybody was at the Fest for Beatles fans last year or the year before, I had some advanced copies of the audio companion disc for the blue book that I was very happy. It's got a nice booklet with it. So that blue book, when it comes out, it will have that. There, like we did with Paul White, God bless him, Paul kindly signed the first 200 copies of the Red Book. Those aren't available anymore, but we're going to do something, a bit of a surprise for the blue book. I won't announce that yet, but that's something that will be announced soon. The limited edition, first 200, will be signed by some special people. And, you know, you can find me pretty much on Twitter. I don't do much on Facebook. I don't use Instagram. Another place where you can buy the books, or you've been able to buy the books before, and probably the first stop for the blue book will be the Fest for Beatles fans in New York. And they've been a great supporter of the book projects over the years. So thank you, Ethan, for a great interview. And we talked a bit about the Yardbirds. I don't know how we got there, but I guess through the Capital of Canada thing. Mm-hmm. And thank you for your interest in the Beatles in Canada. It's been a real privilege to be able to write these books. And it's been a lot of fun interviewing people and doing the research. And thankfully, I'd done it all before this this current situation where, you know, libraries are closed. And, you know, I'd just like to put a shout out to libraries, because I've visited libraries all over the world. And without libraries, without archives, none of this would be possible.
Mm-hmm. Piers, thank you so much for coming on the show. To everyone at home.
Yeah, well, thank you.
Thanks for listening, and guess that's it. Ta-ta for now.
Fans on the Run is produced by Ethan Alexanian. Additional voiceovers by Richard Phillip. This has been a Showtown production.